Ever think about what it takes to, like, completely transform your life? I mean, we're not talking about switching up your morning coffee order, but like a real fundamental shift in who you are and what you believe. Today's deep dive takes us into one of history's most fascinating personal journeys, the journey of William Wilberforce. You might know him as a key figure in the abolition of slavery, but before he became a global icon, he was a young man living the high life in the heart of British politics.
And that's what makes Wilberforce's story so intriguing. This wasn't someone who stumbled into greatness out of desperation. He was already on top of the world, at least externally.
Right, imagine. Late 1700s, England. Wilberforce is in his mid-20s, a member of parliament, charming, wealthy, the life of the party. We're talking dancing until 5 in the morning kind of nights.
Oh, absolutely. There's an entry in his diary where he casually mentions dancing until dawn. It really paints a picture of a young man embracing every bit of fun and luxury his position offered.
And that's precisely what makes his transformation so incredible. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We need to understand the how and the why behind his journey. Our deep dive today centers on Wilberforce's own words, his personal diaries, letters from friends, all those intimate glimpses into his thoughts as he grapples with faith, purpose, and ultimately, his place in the world.
And it's not a straight shot from party boy to abolitionist, is it? There are twists and turns, moments of doubt, and some fascinating influences along the way.
And it all begins, surprisingly enough, on a seemingly ordinary trip to France.
It's 1784, and Wilberforce decides to embark on a grand tour of Europe with his family. Now, picture this. Traveling in those days wasn't exactly hopping on a plane. You spent weeks, sometimes months, on the road, so having a good travel companion was essential. And Wilberforce finds one in Isaac Milner.
Okay, so we have Wilberforce, the charming politician, and Milner. Well, imagine a mountain of a man. He wasn't just some random travel buddy, though. This guy was brilliant, a scholar, later becoming a professor. You have to wonder, what kind of conversations were these two having on those long carriage rides?
Well, one of their conversations leads to a pivotal moment. Imagine being on a trip and having someone casually recommend a book that ends up changing your entire outlook on life. That's exactly what happens to Wilberforce when Milner suggests he read Philip Doddridge's The Rise and Progress of Religion in the Soul. Now, this wasn't your light beach reading.
I can only imagine. This is the 1700s. Not exactly known for self-help bestsellers.
Exactly. And Doddridge was heavily influenced by 17th century Puritanism. Now, before you think fire and brimstone sermons, Doddridge's focus was different. He believed in applying faith to everyday life, not just Sunday morning piety, but how you lived, treated others, your whole approach to the world.
So here we have Wilberforce, at this point, not exactly a man of deep religious conviction, handed this rather intense book about faith impacting every aspect of life.
Yeah.
Do we know how he reacted? I mean, did he dive right in, or was he hesitant?
Well, there's no dramatic conversion right there on the spot, but something about Doddridge's words sticks with Wilberforce. Think of it as a seed being planted. He's curious, intrigued, and that curiosity marks the beginning of his slow and often agonizing transformation.
So Wilberforce returns to England, this book tucked away in his mind, and what does he do? He dives right back into the whirlwind of politics and social life.
Right, and initially it seems like nothing much has changed, but there are these subtle hints, like little cracks starting to show in his carefree facade. He writes about attending parliament, engaging in debates, but something feels different. There's this growing sense of disillusionment, almost like he's seeing the emptiness behind the glamour he once thrived on.
Can you blame him? I mean, we've all experienced that feeling of, say, achieving a goal we thought would bring ultimate happiness, only to find it kind of hollow. Imagine experiencing that on a grand scale, in the halls of Parliament, no less.
Absolutely, and it's not just the political scene. He starts questioning his wealth, his privilege. There's a passage in his diary where he describes seeing a wealthy friend and observes, "It's strange that the most generous men and religious do not see that their duties increase with their fortune." It's like he's realizing that true fulfillment isn't about accumulating wealth and status, but about responsibility, about using what you have to make a difference.
And this internal struggle, this growing disconnect between the life he's living and the person he's becoming, eventually leads to a full-blown crisis.
Exactly. Wilberforce describes this period as a time of intense emotional turmoil, filled with guilt and a sense of his own shortcomings. He writes, "I felt myself to be a wretch." This wasn't some intellectual exercise. This was a deep personal reckoning.
So much of what we know about Wilberforce comes from his diaries, those raw, honest reflections. In those pages, you really get a sense of the man behind the historical figure. What's fascinating is that his conversion experience wasn't like those dramatic lightning bolt moments we sometimes hear about. It was a slow burn, a gradual unraveling, followed by this intense period of introspection.
It's important to remember the historical context here. In 18th century England, religious conversions, particularly among the upper classes, weren't unheard of. But they often followed a particular pattern. Take John Wesley, for example, the founder of Methodism. He had this incredibly powerful, almost supernatural conversion experience.
Right, visions, voices, feeling the Holy Spirit move through him.
Exactly. But Wilberforce's experience was different. It was internal, agonizing, and, dare I say, intellectual. He was grappling with big existential questions, questioning his very purpose. And that leads us to ask, why now? Why this moment in his life? He had already achieved so much. What was it about this period that pushed him to this point of crisis and ultimately transformation?
It's like he's at a crossroads.
Well, right.
Successful by all outward measures, yet wrestling with his deep inner turmoil. So what does someone in Wilberforce's position do?
He does what many of us might do when faced with life-altering decisions. He seeks guidance, but not just from anyone. Wilberforce confides in two extraordinary individuals, two individuals who represent very different perspectives. William Pitt, the Prime Minister of England, and John Newton, a former slave trader turned abolitionist.
Wow, talk about a study in contrasts. On one hand, you have the pinnacle of political power, and on the other, someone who had experienced the darkest side of humanity firsthand. You couldn't ask for two more different perspectives.
And their responses to Wilberforce's crisis are equally fascinating. Pitt, the consummate politician, actually urges Wilberforce to channel his newfound faith into action. He argues that true Christian principles shouldn't lead to withdrawing from the world.
That's interesting. You might expect a politician to be more concerned with, well, politics, but here's Pitt encouraging Wilberforce to embrace his spiritual side.
Precisely. Pitt believed that Wilberforce could make a greater impact by integrating his faith into his public life. He saw the potential for good, even within the often murky world of politics.
And what about Newton? How does the former slave trader respond to Wilberforce's spiritual crisis?
Newton's approach is more pastoral, more focused on providing comfort and reassurance. He had experienced his own profound spiritual transformation, repenting for his past sins and dedicating his life to fighting slavery.
It's almost as if fate brought these two men, Wilberforce and Newton, together at this critical juncture. I mean, here's Wilberforce wrestling with his conscience and purpose, and he finds solace in someone who had grappled with the very issues that would come to define his life's work. The horrors of slavery, the fight for abolition.
And it's important to remember that Newton wasn't some distant figure offering theoretical advice. He had seen the brutality of the slave trade firsthand, the dehumanization, the suffering. His influence on Wilberforce went beyond theological discussions. It offered a raw, unfiltered understanding of the issue that would soon consume Wilberforce's life.
So we have Wilberforce seeking guidance from these two very different figures, both encouraging him to find a way to live his faith authentically. What does he do with this advice? Does he retreat from public life, as some might expect?
He doesn't, and this is where we see the essence of evangelicalism, which heavily influenced Wilberforce, come into play. It wasn't just about personal piety or private moments of faith. It was about action, about actively working to make the world a better place.
Okay, so no monastic life for Wilberforce. He takes this call to action seriously. But how? What does that look like for him?
He starts by making changes in his own life. He resigns from those exclusive clubs, those symbols of his former life. He dives deeper into his faith, studying the Bible, attending religious meetings, surrounding himself with like-minded individuals.
But he doesn't abandon his political career, does he?
No, he doesn't. He remains in Parliament, but his approach is fundamentally different. He talks about adopting a new golden rule for his political conduct, to do as I would be done by. Imagine that. Trying to operate with fairness and compassion in the cutthroat world of 18th century politics.
It's almost radical, isn't it? And this commitment to aligning his actions with his beliefs is evident in everything he does from this point forward.
This wasn't about personal gain anymore. It was about using his position, his influence to serve a greater purpose.
So Wilberforce's transformation wasn't just a private internal shift. It manifested in his public life, in his relationships, in his unwavering commitment to fighting for social justice. And that's what makes his story so enduringly relevant even today. It reminds us that real change often begins with deep introspection, with questioning our own motivations and aligning our actions with our values.
Exactly. Wilberforce's journey challenges us to consider, what are we truly passionate about? What legacy are we building? And are we living in a way that reflects our deepest values?
These are big questions, and ones I hope our listeners will contemplate further. We've only scratched the surface of Wilberforce's incredible life and work. If this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, I encourage you to delve into his diaries, his writings on the abolition of slavery. They offer an even richer understanding of this complex and inspiring figure. Until next time, keep diving deep.